Okay, in this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of a variable and how it's used specifically in App Inventor, but a little bit about just computer science in general. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see some notes that I've prepared. So here we go, our variable notes. This is the first thing we're going to talk about. And here are the learning objectives that we're going to have for this. The first thing is just simply to know what a variable is. I will say about this before we even get started, just so that you don't write me off too quickly. Variable, as that word is used in computer science, is not the same as it is in most other uses. It's a little different than the way it's used in math. It's a little different than the way it's used in English. It's a little different than the way it's used in science. Okay, so computer science has taken this word that's really fairly common in the English language and in all these different fields and put its own little spin on it. So don't just write this off thinking, oh, you know everything there is to know about variables. Okay, so just so you're aware of that as we get started. Our second learning objective, know the 4 different kinds of variables and be able to give an example of them, and then describe the difference between local and global variables. We are going to spend a little bit of time to look at variables in App Inventor specifically, but that'll be a pretty minor part of this video. The first 3 really are our main learning objectives. All right, so with that said, let's get started. What is a variable specifically as the word is used in computer science? So in computer science, a variable is simply a place within your program where data gets stored. Okay, there's a couple important things here to realize. One is it's a storage location. That's what it is. 2 is that it's in your program, meaning that when the program gets shut down or closed out, that data is lost because the program no longer is holding that anymore. So typically, there are ways around that. But in the apps that we'll be building with App Inventor, that's almost always going to be the case. When you close the app, the data will be lost. Okay, so that's what a variable is. Now, throughout our course, we're going to be building an analogy as we talk about storing data. And so I want to share a helpful analogy with you right now. A variable is kind of like a piece of paper. If you think of a piece of paper, you can take out a piece of paper, you can write on it. Once you've written something on it, if you change your mind, you can erase it and write something different. You can change your mind again and write something different. And you can do that over and over and over and over again. This thing, though, is that with a variable, it's not even as much as like a big piece of paper. It's like a 3x5 card, or maybe even smaller, a Post-it note or something, because you can only really put one piece of data on it. Okay, in a variable, you can only put one piece of data. You can't put lots and lots and lots of different things. So now the piece of data could be big. It could be a word with lots and lots of letters in it, or it could be a number with lots and lots of digits. So the piece of data could be large, but you can still only keep track of one piece of data per variable. So it's like if you have a piece of paper and you're only allowed to write one name on it, or only allowed to write one number on it. That's the kind of thing. Variables all get names. So it's kind of like if your piece of paper has a title at the top. So you take your piece of paper, you title it, you write the one thing on there. So maybe the title of your paper is My Age. And then the one thing you write on there is how old you are right now. So maybe you're 16 or 17 or 18 or whatever you are. It has that one number, and then that's it. Okay, so that's kind of like what a variable is in computer science. And one thing that you'll have to get used to working in computer science is realizing that computers really are kind of dumb things. They only do exactly what you tell them to do. So if you have some data on a piece of paper and you want the computer to remember what was on the piece of paper, you have to tell the computer to go and look at the piece of paper. It won't just do it by itself. You have to tell it to do it. So in App Inventor, the way that works is we will say get a variable. That means go to the piece of paper and get the information that was on it. Okay. Also, the computer won't ever put something on the paper unless you tell it to. So if you want the computer to be able to remember how old it is, to take that age example, then the computer, you have to tell it to go to the piece of paper called age and write its age on there. So write down 18, let's say. Then later on, when the computer needs to remember how old it is, you need to tell the computer to go to the paper and look at it to see what it wrote on there. So the computer will never do those things automatically. You always have to tell it to interact with the variable every time you want to change the variable's value or remember what the variable was equal to. Okay, so that's the idea of a variable. Okay, that's a big picture idea. That idea right there is really the crux of these notes, which is why I've spent a lot of time on this slide right here. All right, so with that said, let's move on to the next slide. There is a need to initialize the variable. So in some computer languages, they call it declaring a variable. In App Inventor, they call it initializing the variable. I think you would say, if a really firm computer science would say, there's probably a slight difference between those two things. For us right now, since we're going to be focusing on App Inventor, let's just focus and worry about what it means to initialize. So when you initialize a variable, you really do two things. You give it a name and you give it an initial value. So if the initial value doesn't matter, then you can stick anything there. Really, it's a fine. But sometimes in some programs, you want the variable to start with a particular value because you're going to use that as the program starts to move on. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. So I'll show you what it looks like when you initialize a variable in just a second. But before you can use a variable, you must initialize it. And that's always going to be true in App Inventor. Okay? So there's, going back to our analogy, initializing a variable is like getting the piece of paper you need and then writing a name on the top of it. Okay, that's kind of the idea. All right, so here we go. Here are some examples of different kinds of variables. So one of your learning objectives is to know the 4 different kinds. So here's 2 out of the 4. The first one is called a Boolean. Booleans are variables that are either true or they're false. They're never anything else. So the 2 examples that I have there in the picture, you see the orange block. Now that's a screenshot from App Inventor. So this is exactly what it'll look like in App Inventor. I've got one orange block where it says initialize global Boolean 1 to true. Okay, so let me explain what the 4 parts to that block are. In one part, you have the statement that tells you what the block is doing. This block is initializing the variable. That's what it's doing. Then you've got the part right here inside of that little rectangle. That's the name of the variable. So this variable is named Boolean number 1. Okay. And then the last part is the part that's a different color. That's the value of the variable. So Boolean number 1 was initialized to be equal true. So that means somebody got out a piece of paper. At the top of the paper, they labeled it Boolean number 1. And then in great big letters, they wrote the word true on it. Okay. And then with Booleans, there's only 2 options. It's either true or it's false. There's no other options. So this is the only kind of Boolean that you could have, is one that's true, or like Boolean number 2, one that's false. Those are your only options. Those are the only things that you can see. Okay, so that's the first type of variable. A true or a false variable is called a Boolean. The second type of variable is called an integer. Okay, now you might know that word from math class, and in math class and in computer science, that word basically means more or less the same thing. It's a number that does not have a decimal or a fraction part to it. So it can be positive, it can be negative, it can be 0. It just can't have decimals or fractions. Okay, so in the example here, negative 52. And again, you can see exactly what those blocks would look like. This is the initializing of a variable that's named integer number 1. These are not very good names, by the way. You usually want to give your variables good descriptive names, okay? But integer number 1, and it equals the number negative 52. All right, so those are our first 2 types, Booleans and integers. Next, we have floats and strings. These are our next 2 types. Now, float is another kind of a number, but this is a number that does have decimals. Again, it can be positive, it can be negative, but it has a decimal or a fraction component to it. So you can see 17.3, something like that, okay? And then a string is, I think the easiest way to think of a string is it's like a password. It can be numbers, just like floats and integers. It can be letters. It can be symbols. It can be any mixture of all of the above. It can even have like spaces and things inside of it. The letters can be capital or they can be lowercase. All of these are fine things to have with strings. And And when we'll talk about later in our class, when you start comparing variables against each other, all of those things would make one different than another. In other words, kind of like rules are for passwords. If I have one variable and it equals ABC123, and then I have another variable that's capital A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, the computer will see those as two different things because one's capital and one's not, okay? So that's the idea of a string. It's just any combination of letters or numbers or symbols. It says letters or numbers here, but or symbols. You can have a $ or, you know, whatever, that's all fine, okay? So those are our 4 types of variables: Booleans, integers, floats, and strings. Those are our 4 types. Okay. Now, one thing that you'll notice with App Inventor is that it gives everything a color code. So when we're working with variables, you'll always see an orange block. Anytime you see an orange block, that means that this is a variable. And then in this case, the different kinds of variables have different colors. So Booleans are green, strings are this pinkish purplish color. Notice floats and integers get the same color in App Inventor. That's because technically in App Inventor, it treats both of those like it's the same type of variable. Other programming languages don't do that. So you do need to be careful when you get to more advanced computer programming languages, whether it's actually a float or whether it's actually an integer. App Inventor will let you kind of switch back and forth without paying any attention, and you'll be fine. All right, so there we go. Those are our 4 types. Let's talk about the difference between a local and a global variable real quick. And this was our 3rd, and really for the purposes of this video, this is our last major topic. I'm going to show you just a little bit about App Inventor, but basically this is our last major topic. A global variable is a variable that can be accessed from anywhere in the program. Anywhere at all, anything can look at that variable and read what it is. But a local variable can only be viewed or used within a specific control structure. So I'll show you what that looks like in App Inventor in just a second. But the bottom line is when you initialize a global variable, you do it outside of all the structure, all the other structures in your program. And because it's outside of all the structures, every structure is able to kind of look up and see it. It's kind of like if the global variable was, you know, posted in the clouds in the sky, everything all around the ground. It doesn't matter if you're here or there or the other place, everybody can look up and they can all see the global variable, okay? But a local variable, you can only see it right there. So it'd be like if instead of putting it in the sky, if I painted it on my ceiling, now you can only see it if you're in my room. If you go in a different room, you can't see it. If you go outside, you can't see it. But as long as you're in my room, then you can see it because it's just local. It's just in my room, and that's the only place where you can see it. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between a global and a local. All right, so I said I wanted to show you a little bit in App Inventor of what some of these things look like. So let's switch over to App Inventor here real quick, and let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, notice in App Inventor, I have some tool drawers. Whoa, that is not what I meant to do. I apologize for that. Things are funky. Let's go. Let's do this. Sorry about this. I just hit the wrong button by accident. There we go. That's what I want. I want to be back here. Now let's do there. That's what I meant to do. Okay. So when you're in App Inventor, you've seen already that there's these tool drawers over here. The tool drawers are have all kinds of different things in them that you'll use while you're programming. And specifically right now, we're going to be working with variables. So we're going to look in the variable tool drawer. And you can see there's where you initialize, and you just drop that anywhere you want into your workspace. And that makes it a global because you can see it from anywhere. Okay, so let's just make this one a number. Let's make it equal to 0. You should always give your variables a descriptive name so that you understand what it is. So I wouldn't ever just give a variable the name variable or something. I want to make sure that when I look at my program or when somebody else looks at my program, they know exactly what kind of information that variable is holding. So make sure you give it a good name. Okay. So this is an example of a global variable. It's outside of any type of control structure. Now, control structures have all kinds of different, these are these kind of brownish colors. There's all kinds of different things that we can do with control structures. But notice, let's see, here we go. Notice that these two control structures, they have one of these orangish pinkish things built into it. That's an example of a local variable. So notice when I go to my global variable, I can get it. So that means the computer's looking at the value and remembering what was there. Or I can set it. That means the computer is going to the piece of paper and writing something new on it, okay? And with this thing built into it, there's this local variable, and I can do the exact same things. I can get it, or I can set it. But notice when I do those things out here, I get this red X. That's an error, because it doesn't work out here. These things work, because they work anywhere, because it's a global variable. This, it only works if I put it inside of that structure. Now that red X is gone because it's on the inside. Same thing here. It's not connected to something inside the structure, but if I connect it, now that red X is gone because it's inside of the structure where that variable is defined. Okay. Now you can also take a control structure that does not have a local variable that's part of it. And you can make a local variable part of it by initializing a local variable and sticking it inside of that control structure. And then same thing, it acts locally. So if I'm outside of the control structure, I get that error message. But once I'm inside, then it works. Okay. You do have to be careful because it's possible to be in the control structure, but outside the spot where the variable is defined. Notice that does give you an error. Okay. So initially in our class at the beginning, we'll almost always use global variables at the beginning, unless it's built into the control structure. Okay, so like that first one that I showed you, this one here, it's built into the control structure. I don't have to initialize a local variable with something like this. And at the beginning of our class, this is the only kind of local variable that we'll use. But as we go a little bit further and we learn a little bit more about programming and some more advanced things, we'll find that there are times where you might use a local variable that's not built into the control structure. And we'll talk about that then. Okay, so I think that takes care of our notes for variables. Thanks for watching this video. Have a good one.